the 14th of October 1943. The 8th Air Force will remember this date as Black Thursday. At 8,000 feet above the freezing gray chop of the North Sea, a single B-17 Flying Fortress is bleeding hydraulic fluid and altitude. It is a straggler, a wounded animal separated from the protection of the combat box. Trailing black smoke from the No. 3 engine, it is dragging itself toward England at 140 knots. Weaving above it in a protective S pattern is a P-47 Thunderbolt. The pilot, Captain Howell, isn't looking at the German coast fading behind him. He is staring at a math problem that ends in death. The English coast is 38 minutes away. His fuel gauge reads less than 3. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine is consuming fuel at a rate that defies the laws of survival, and the main tanks are dry. Military doctrine dictates he should have turned back at Aachen. Physics dictates he should bail out now, while he still has enough altitude to clear the tail. But he isn't turning, he isn't climbing, he is throttling back, leaning the mixture to the ragged edge of starvation and preparing to commit the ultimate tactical sin. To understand why a fighter pilot would willingly fly an 8-ton aircraft into the ocean, we have to look at the fatal flaw of the 1943 Air War. That fatal flaw was a failure of strategic imagination known as the radius of action. 6 hours earlier, in the damp briefing room at Thorpe Abbotts, the bomber crews of the 100th Bomb Group stared at the map tape stretched across the wall. It was a straight red line piercing the heart of the Third Reich. Target: the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The intelligence officer, a clean-shaved major who had never felt the concussion of a flak burst, tapped the map with a pointer. He promised that the Luftwaffe fighter force was depleted. He promised that the B-17 Flying Fortress formations, with their overlapping fields of fire, could defend themselves. He was lying, or he was delusional. The men in sheepskin jackets and crushed caps knew the truth. Without fighter escort, a bomber formation is not a fortress. It is a buffet. But in October 1943, the escort fighters were on a leash. The P-47 Thunderbolt, affectionately and fearfully known as the Jug, was the premier American escort of the day. It was a massive machine, a 7-ton milk bottle wrapped around the most powerful piston engine in production, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This 18-cylinder radial engine churned out 2,000 horsepower, allowing the Jug to outdive anything in the sky and absorb punishment that would disintegrate a Spitfire. But that raw power came with a gluttonous thirst. At cruising speed, the Double Wasp guzzled 100 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel every hour, pushed the throttle past the gate into war emergency power, and that consumption tripled to nearly 300 gallons an hour. The P-47D carried only 305 gallons in its internal fuselage tanks. Do the math. Even with conservative throttle management, the Thunderbolt had an endurance of barely 2 hours of combat flying. The solution should have been simple: drop tanks. These were external fuel pods slung under the wings or belly, feeding the engine during the cruise out and jettisoned when the shooting started. But in the autumn of 1943, reliable pressurized drop tanks were a logistical ghost. They were scarce, prone to freezing at 25,000 feet, and often failed to feed. So, the leash remained tight. The P-47 seconds could escort the bombers across the Channel, over the Netherlands, and as far as the German border near Aachen. But there, at the invisible line of the radius of action, the fuel gauges would dictate a retreat. As Captain Howell and his flight of Thunderbolts reached that line on October 14, the reality of the air war became a physical sickness in their stomachs. Below them, the Rhine River snaked through the landscape, the threshold of the enemy's heartland. Ahead, the B-17 formations pressed on, 300 heavy bombers droning into the hostile gray sky. Big friends, this is little friends. We've reached bingo fuel, returning to base. Good luck. The radio call was standard procedure, but it felt like betrayal. As the P-47 seconds banked away, turning 180 degrees back toward England, the Luftwaffe was waiting. The German fighter controllers had mastered the timing. They knew exactly where the American fighters had to turn back. They called it the Q. Just beyond the range of the Thunderbolts, wings of Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds and Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds were circling, assembling like sharks smelling blood in the water. They watched the P-47 seconds fade into the distance, and then they pounced. The slaughter was immediate. The Luftwaffe attacked from the front, the 12 o'clock high position. slashing through the bomber formations with 20mm cannon fire. B-17 seconds folded their wings and fell. Parachutes blossomed. The sky filled with debris, aluminum skin, engine cowlings, and men. In the chaos, Lieutenant Hayes's B-17 took a 20mm shell through the No. 3 engine. The vibrations were catastrophic. The bomber shuddered, lost airspeed, and dropped out of the protective combat box, a straggler. In the cold calculus of aerial warfare, a straggler is already dead. Isolated from the defensive fire of the group, it is an easy kill, a training target for rookie German pilots. Hayes turned his crippled bird west, hoping to limp home, but he was alone in a hostile sky. Or so he thought. High above, Captain Howell had ignored the turn-back order. He had watched the massacre begin and made a decision that violated every protocol in the Army Air Force's handbook. He didn't bank left with his squadron. He watched his fuel gauge, watched the slaughter, and then pushed the throttle forward. He had enough gas to get home, or enough gas to fight. He couldn't do both. He latched onto the wounded bomber, weaving in a protective S pattern to maintain his higher speed while staying close to the slow-moving fortress. This maneuver burned even more precious fuel, but it established a visual promise. I am still here. But the physics of flight are unforgiving. As the bomber crawled toward the coast, bleeding altitude, Howell's fuel needle dropped past the quarter tank mark. Then the 8th. He had fought off the first wave of opportunists, burning minutes of fuel in high G turns, but now the real threat appeared. Not random hunters, but a coordinated flight of 6 Bf-109 seconds from JG-26, the Abbeville Boys, the elite of the Luftwaffe Western Front. They spotted the lone, smoking bomber and the solitary escort. They didn't see a threat, they saw a trophy. They began their climb, positioning themselves up-sun, preparing to execute a synchronized execution. Howell checked his gauge. Empty is a relative term in aviation. There is always a little unusable fuel sloshing in the bottom of the tank, vapors and dregs. He was flying on fumes. He had 2,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition and an engine that was about to become a breathless lump of iron. He keyed his mic. "Big friend, keep your heading. I'm going to clear the road." He wasn't just fighting the Germans. He was fighting the clock. Every second the engine ran was a miracle, and every second brought him closer to the freezing water below. The radius of action had been broken, and now the price had to be paid. That price was usually calculated in courts-martial. In the rigid hierarchy of the Army Air Forces, bingo fuel was not a suggestion. It was a commandment written in the blood of pilots who had pushed their luck too far. The logic of 8 Fighter Command was brutal but sound. A fighter pilot who runs out of gas over enemy territory is a wasted asset. He cannot shoot, he cannot defend, and he essentially hands a $50,000 airframe to the enemy. To voluntarily fly past the point of no return was not bravery. In the eyes of the brass, it was theft. Captain Howell knew the regulations by heart. He knew that by ignoring the recall signal, he was technically stealing government property. But regulations are written in warm offices, and Howell was sitting in a freezing, unpressurized cockpit at 22,000 feet, watching a massacre unfold. The instrument panel in front of him told a grim story. The fuel gauge for the main fuselage tank was bouncing near the red, empty hash mark. The auxiliary tank was already dry. Standard procedure dictated he should be at 30,000 feet, cruising at low RPM on a direct vector for East Anglia. Instead, he was descending, burning potential energy he couldn't get back, to place his aircraft between the wolves and the sheep. This was the heretical solution. It wasn't a new mechanical part or a clever navigation trick. It was the conscious decision to treat the P-47 Thunderbolt not as a reusable weapon, but as a disposable shield. Howell looked over his left shoulder. The B-17, trailing its banner of black smoke, was crawling across the sky. Inside that aluminum tube were 10 men. Maybe some were already dead. Maybe the pilot, Hayes, was wrestling with a dead stick. But as long as those propellers were turning, they were fighting. Howell looked to his right. The 6 Bf-109 seconds had finished their climb. They were positioning themselves in the sunspot, the blinding glare of the sun that renders attacking aircraft invisible to gunners until the muzzle flashes sparkle. These weren't rookie pilots. Their formation was loose and fluid, the sign of veterans who trusted their wingmen. They were setting up for a slash attack. A high-speed dive through the bomber's blind spots. intending to rip the wings off with 20mm cannon fire. If Howell left now, he might have enough vapor in the lines to glide across the channel and belly land on the English coast. If he stayed to disrupt this attack, the high-power maneuvering would drain his remaining fuel in minutes. He would never see an airfield again. He reached down to the mixture control lever and pushed it forward to auto-rich. He advanced the propeller pitch control, the engine note rising from a low rumble to a high-pitched scream. He was done calculating. "Big friend, brake left. Brake left now." Howell racked the heavy fighter onto its wingtip. The P-47 groaned under the G-load. This was the specific heresy of his decision. He was intentionally throwing away his energy advantage. The Thunderbolt was a high-altitude energy fighter, designed to dive, shoot, and zoom climb back up. It was heavy, sluggish in a slow turn, and accelerated poorly. By dropping down to the bomber's level to intercept the Germans, Howell was entering a knife fight in a phone booth. The lead German pair saw the lone Thunderbolt turn into them and paused. It didn't make sense. One American fighter, clearly low on fuel given the distance from England, challenging 6 Messerschmitts? It was tactical suicide. They expected him to flee. When he didn't, it disrupted their carefully geometry. This hesitation was the weapon. Howell didn't need to shoot down all 6. He just needed to ruin their aim. He drove the Thunderbolt straight at the leader's nose, a game of chicken, played at a closure rate of 600 miles per hour. The German pilot, perhaps thinking of a warm bed or a medal, flinched. He broke formation, banking sharp right to avoid the collision. The pack scattered. The disciplined killing box dissolved into a chaotic furball. Howell hauled back on the stick, the G-forces crushing him into the seat. His vision grayed at the edges, the tunnel closing in as blood drained from his brain. The heavy P-47 shuddered, bleeding speed in the turn. But he managed to bring the nose around. He wasn't flying for home anymore. He was flying for time. Every second he kept the Germans busy was a second the B-17 moved closer to the coast. He had accepted the trade, his aircraft for their lives. But as he lined up his sights on a trailing 109, a new reality began to set in. He wasn't just going to run out of fuel. He was going to have to put this massive machine into the water. And that realization brought a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the enemy fire. He knew something the bomber crew didn't. He knew the dirty secret of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It was built like a tank to survive the air, but it was designed with a fatal flaw that made it a death trap in the sea. The heretical solution had solved the tactical problem of the German fighters, but it had just signed his death warrant for the landing to come. That death warrant was stamped by the very engineering that made the Thunderbolt invincible in the air. The P-47 was not designed by a pilot. It was designed by a propulsion engineer named Alexander Kartveli, and he had built the aircraft around a single, massive component, the turbo supercharger system. To understand why Captain Howell was effectively committing suicide by choosing to ditch, you have to look at the belly of the beast. The P-47 wasn't sleek like the P-51 Mustang, or buoyant like the Spitfire. It was a 7-ton industrial maze of ductwork. The heart of the aircraft, that R-2800 engine, needed enormous amounts of air to function at high altitude. Kartveli solved this by placing a gaping intake scoop at the bottom of the cowling, directly under the propeller. This chin swallowed air, channeled it through a massive duct running beneath the pilot's seat all the way to the tail, compressed it, and shot it back to the engine. In the thin air of the stratosphere, this design was genius. It allowed the jug to dominate above 30,000 feet. But at sea level, facing the choppy surface of the North Sea, that ducting system became a lethal liability known as the scoop trap. Aerodynamically, the P-47 was a brick. It had an exceptionally high wing loading, the ratio of aircraft weight to wing area. A Spitfire could glide gracefully if the engine quit. The P-47 did not glide. It fell ballistically. Without the pull of the propeller, the lift evaporated instantly. To keep the aircraft from stalling and spinning into the ocean, a pilot had to keep the nose down, maintaining a terrifyingly high airspeed of 100 miles per hour just to stay under control. But the real horror awaited at the water's surface. U.S. Army Air Force's flight manuals were usually dry and optimistic, but the section on ditching the Thunderbolt was grimly concise. It warned that the lower intake duct acted like a giant hydro brake. Imagine driving a car at 100 miles per hour into a shallow lake with the hood ripped off and a snowplow blade attached to the bumper. That is the physics of ditching a P-47. The moment the belly touches the waves, that open scoop gulps tons of seawater instantly. The drag coefficient spikes from manageable to infinite in a fraction of a second. The result is catastrophic deceleration. The nose digs in, anchoring the front of the plane while the heavy tail, still moving at 100 miles per hour, whips over the top. The aircraft doesn't just splash, it cartwheels. The cockpit, with the pilot strapped inside, is slammed inverted underwater, often crushing the canopy and trapping the airman in a freezing, submerged steel coffin. Howell knew this. Every pilot in the 56 Fighter Group knew the stories. They had seen gun camera footage of Thunderbolts hitting the channel, vanishing in a wall of white spray, and never resurfacing. Yet, as he pulled the Thunderbolt out of a shuddering left-hand turn, Howell pushed that knowledge into a dark corner of his mind. He had more immediate problems than the water. He had the wolves. The 6 BF-109 seconds had recovered from the initial shock of his head-on charge. They had scattered, regrouped, and were now angry. They realized they weren't facing a fresh squadron, but a single, desperate lunatic, and they knew his weakness. They began to use energy tactics. They climbed high, using their lighter airframes to gain altitude quickly, storing up potential energy before diving on the heavy P-47. They were playing with him, booming and zooming, taking pot shots with their cannons, and then rocketing back up where he couldn't follow. Howell's engine was screaming. The manifold pressure gauge was redlining. He was burning his remaining fuel at a rate of 4 gallons a minute. He hauled the stick back, trying to get the nose up to fire a snapshot at a Messerschmitt diving across his bow. The heavy jug shuddered, teetering on the edge of a high-speed stall. He missed. The German fighter flashed past, its camouflage paint blurring into a gray streak. "Jersey, you're trailing smoke." The voice in his headset was Hayes, the bomber pilot. But it wasn't smoke from damage. It was the exhaust of an engine being run at extreme power settings with a lean fuel mixture. He was cooking the cylinders. Howell didn't answer. He was wrestling the 8-ton anvil through a defensive barrel roll, spoiling the aim of another attacker. His arms ached. The P-47 lacked hydraulic boost for the flight controls. At high speeds, moving the ailerons required brute physical strength. He was fighting the Germans, the gravity, the ocean, and the machine itself. He checked the fuel gauge again. The needle had stopped bouncing. It was dead still, resting on the stop pin below the E. He had maybe 90 seconds of power left. 90 seconds before the silence. 90 seconds before the scoop met the water. Most men would have turned for the nearest ship or pulled altitude to bail out. But Howell looked at the B-17. It was lower now, barely 2,000 feet off the deck. The bomber was losing the fight against gravity. If he bailed out now, the Germans would finish the fortress in 30 seconds. He had to make the Germans leave. He had to hurt them so badly, so quickly, that the cost of killing the bomber became too high. He had to stop flying defensively. He shoved the throttle through the wire gate, breaking the safety seal into war emergency power. The Pratt & Whitney engine roared with a sound like tearing canvas. Water injection kicked in, cooling the fuel-air mixture and adding a burst of horsepower. He wasn't going to wait for them to dive on him. He was going to take the anvil and swing it back at them one last time. That swing began with a maneuver that defied the defensive instincts of every pilot trained in the gentle art of dogfighting. Howell pushed the stick forward and let gravity take the wheel. The anvil dropped. The P-47 didn't accelerate. It surged. In a dive, the Thunderbolt's massive weight ceased to be a liability and became its greatest kinetic weapon. Within seconds, the airspeed indicator wound past 400 miles per hour, the airframe vibrating as it approached the sound barrier's jagged edge. The BF-109 seconds, nimble and light, were climbers, dancers of the vertical fight. But in a power dive, the Jug was a runaway freight train. Howell wasn't trying to turn with them. He was converting his remaining altitude into raw velocity to execute a slash and run through their formation, but with a terrifying twist. Instead of diving away to escape, he used the speed to pull up from below, directly into the face of the diving Germans. He was forcing a head-on engagement. In the lexicon of aerial combat, the head-on is a game of pure nerve. Two aircraft hurtle toward each other at a closing speed of over 700 miles per hour. There is no time for deflection, shooting, or calculating lead angles. You simply point the nose at the enemy windscreen, hold down the trigger, and wait for the other man to flinch. And Howell held the aces. He knew the anatomical difference between his machine and theirs. The German Messerschmitt was powered by the Daimler-Benz DB605, a liquid-cooled inverted V12 engine. It was a masterpiece of engineering, but it had a glass jaw. A single, 50 caliber round, piercing the coolant jacket would drain the glycol system, causing the engine to seize in minutes. Howell's Pratt & Whitney R2800, however, was air-cooled. It was a radial engine, a massive wall of steel cylinders protecting the pilot like a buckler shield. A radial could take a piston straight through a cylinder head and keep churning. Howell was betting his life on American steel against German precision. At 800 yards, the leading German ace opened fire. The wings of the Bf-109 sparkled as its cannons erupted. The Germans were firing Minengeschoss, mine shells. Unlike standard armor-piercing rounds that punched clean holes, these were thin-walled steel casings packed with high explosives. When they hit aluminum skin, they didn't penetrate, they detonated. A single hit could blow a hole the size of a man's chest in a wing or fuselage. Tracers whipped past Howell's canopy, angry neon streaks in the gray sky. A thud shuddered through the airframe as a 20mm shell clipped his vertical stabilizer, tearing away a chunk of the rudder. Howell didn't blink. He kicked the pedals to compensate and kept the nose locked on the center 109. At 400 yards, Howell squeezed the trigger. The P-47 shuddered violently as all 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns roared to life. This was the Jug's signature voice. Most fighters carried 4 or 6 guns. The Thunderbolt carried 8. Together, they spat out 100 heavy rounds every single second. It wasn't just gunfire, it was a kinetic wall. The API mix armor-piercing incendiary formed a converging cone of destruction that struck the German fighter with the force of a physical blow. The results were instantaneous and horrific. The stream of lead sawed through the Bf-109's cowling. The delicate Daimler-Benz engine disintegrated. The canopy shattered. The right wing, structurally compromised by the buzzsaw of bullets, folded upward, torn away by aerodynamic forces. The German fighter didn't fall. It ceased to exist as a flying machine, transforming into a tumbling cloud of fire and debris. Howell flew straight through the smoke of his kill. Oil splattered his windshield. He yanked the stick back, trading his massive speed for altitude, wrestling the heavy fighter up for one more pass. The remaining 5 Germans were stunned. They had expected a scared rabbit. They had found a cornered badger. They watched their leader disintegrate and hesitated. That hesitation was fueled by their own fuel gauges. Dogfighting at high power burns gas at a prodigious rate. They were far from home, over water, fighting a maniac who seemed willing to ram them. The tactical calculus shifted. The B-17 was damaged, smoking, and losing altitude. It was probably going to crash anyway. Was it worth losing another Messerschmitt to this suicidal escort? The German flight leader tipped his wing, signaling a disengagement. The 5 remaining 109 seconds broke formation, diving away toward the French coast, leaving the sky to the Americans. "They're running! Jersey, they're running!" The cheer from the bomber crew over the radio was ragged, desperate, and euphoric. Howell watched the enemy vanish into the cloud deck. He didn't cheer. He leveled the wings and eased the throttle back, trying to calm the shaking machine. He checked his altimeter, 1,500 feet. He checked the distance, 20 miles of cold water to the coast. He checked the fuel gauge. There was no needle movement. It wasn't just empty, it was dry. The R2800 engine, which had just screamed at 2,500 horsepower to save 10 lives, coughed. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was starvation. The cough was a violent lurch, a momentary silence followed by a surge as the last drops of fuel in the carburetor lines were vaporized. Then, it coughed again. Howell reached for the radio toggle. His voice was flat, drained of adrenaline. "Big friend, my tanks are dry. I'm dead stick." The massive 4-bladed propeller, which had been a blurred disk of power for the last 3 hours, began to slow. The roar of 2,000 horses died away, replaced by the terrifying rhythmic whoosh, whoosh, whoosh of the windmilling blades. The violence of the dogfight was instantly replaced by something far worse: the decibel void. The cockpit was suddenly quiet. No vibration, no roar, just the whistle of the wind through the gun ports and the sound of a man breathing in a mask. The anvil had done its job. Now, Gravity was coming to collect the debt. Gravity did not negotiate. When the propeller of a P-47 stops turning, the aircraft undergoes an instant, terrifying metamorphosis. It sheds the identity of a fighter plane and becomes 8 tons of dead metal, obeying the laws of ballistics rather than aerodynamics. For Captain Howell, the war ended the moment the noise stopped. The silence was absolute. For 3 hours, his world had been a cacophony of combustion, vibration, and gunfire. Now, the only sound was the high-pitched shh of the wind rushing over the plexiglass canopy. This is the decibel void, a sensory vacuum that panic rushes to fill. Howell didn't have time for panic. He had roughly 40 seconds of glide time. He immediately trimmed the nose down. In a Spitfire or a Mustang, a dead engine meant you could trade altitude for distance, gliding for miles. In a Thunderbolt, you traded altitude just to keep air moving over the wings fast enough to prevent a stall. He had to maintain 110 miles per hour, anything less, and the heavy wings would lose their grip on the air, and the aircraft would spin uncontrollably into the sea. He pushed the canopy release handle. The bubble top slid back and locked open. This was the most critical item on the ditching checklist. If the heavy canopy slammed shut on impact, the water pressure would seal it forever, trapping him inside the sinking fuselage. Below him, the North Sea looked less like water and more like cold, gray concrete. The swells were running 3 to 5 feet high, bad conditions for a boat, lethal conditions for a fighter plane with a belly scoop. "I'm going in," Howell transmitted. His voice was calm, the forced detachment of a professional filing his final report. Inside the B-17, Lieutenant Hayes and his crew watched their savior fall. From 2,000 feet, the P-47 looked like a toy dropped by a child. It didn't glide. It swooped, a dark cross silhouette against the whitecaps. "Brace for impact," Howell whispered to himself. He flared the aircraft at 10 feet, pulling the stick back into his gut to bleed off the final speed. The tail dropped. The nose rose. For a split second, the Thunderbolt hung suspended above the waves, a masterpiece of engineering defying gravity one last time. Then the belly scoop caught the top of a swell. The deceleration was violent and instantaneous, like flying into a mountainside. The water grabbed the intake duct, acting as a massive hydraulic brake. The P-47 slammed forward, the nose burying itself in a wall of green water. The tail whipped up, threatening to cartwheel the entire airframe. Howell was thrown against his shoulder harness with crushing force. The gun sight smashed into his helmet. Cold, salty water exploded into the cockpit, instantly filling the space up to his chest. The scoop trap worked exactly as the engineers feared. The aircraft didn't skip. It stopped dead and immediately began to sink. The nose was heavy with the weight of the useless engine, dragging the airframe down. Howell gasped, the shock of the 50-degree water punching the air from his lungs. He fumbled for the harness release. His fingers were numb, clumsy blocks of wood. He found the latch. Click. He pushed free, fighting the inrushing tide that tried to pin him to the seat. He kicked upward, his boots scraping against the instrument panel, and burst to the surface, gasping for air in the oil-slicked swell. He was alone. The P-47 was gone, vanished into the dark water below, taking the war with it. He inflated his Mae West life vest and looked up. The B-17 was low, dangerously low. Smoke was now pouring from a second engine. The fight to keep the bomber airborne had pushed its own machinery past the breaking point. Lieutenant Hayes had seen the splash. He saw the yellow dot of the life vest bobbing in the vast emptiness. He looked at his own instruments. 2 engines turning, hydraulics dead, a wounded crew. They weren't going to make the coast. He could try to stretch the glide, maybe reach the mudflats of the Thames estuary, or he could make a decision that matched the one Howell had made 10 minutes ago. "Prepare for ditching," Hayes ordered over the intercom. "We're setting her down next to the fighter." Unlike the Thunderbolt, the B-17 Flying Fortress was surprisingly seaworthy. Its massive wingspan and broad fuselage allowed it to belly flop with relative grace. Hayes lined up parallel to the swells, ignoring the screaming protest of the stall warning horn, and settled the giant bomber onto the surface. It hit with a massive whoomp, skipping once like a flat stone before plowing into the troughs and settling. The fuselage groaned, rivets popping, but it held together. The crew spilled out of the dorsal hatches, deploying the yellow rubber life rafts. They were efficient, practiced, adrenaline-fueled. They paddled toward the lone man floating in the oil slick. When they hauled Captain Howell into the raft, he was shivering violently, his skin already turning the waxen gray of early hypothermia. The golden hour in the North Sea is a myth. Without an immersion suit, a man has 20 minutes before his muscles seize and his heart stops. Hayes grabbed Howell's hand. There were no speeches, no salutes, just the grip of a man who knew exactly what the math had been. They bobbed there in the silence, 11 men in 2 small rafts, surrounded by the debris of war. The silence was total now. No engines, no guns, just the slap of water against rubber. But that silence was broken 40 minutes later by the distinct, throaty rumble of 3 Napier Sea Lion engines. On the horizon, a shape appeared, throwing up a massive rooster tail of white spray. It was an RAF high-speed launch, HSL, a Type 63 rescue boat. These vessels, affectionately known as crash boats, were the angels of the Channel. They were fast, armed, and crewed by men who specialized in snatching airmen from the freezing grip of the sea. The boat slowed, its engines settling into a deep idle as it pulled alongside the rafts. Hands reached down rough, strong hands belonging to British sailors in wool sweaters. As they hauled Hayes aboard, he didn't move to the warmth of the cabin. He pointed back to the shivering, sodden figure of the fighter pilot being lifted over the gunwale. "That man," Hayes told the British skipper, his voice cracking, "that man is the only reason we're breathing." The skipper looked at the P-47 pilot, then at the empty ocean where a 7-ton fighter plane now rested on the bottom. He nodded. "Right then," the skipper said, "tea and rum in the galley. Let's get you boys home." They had survived the Luftwaffe, the physics of drag, and the North Sea. But the story of the P-47 Jug wasn't just about one rescue. It was about a realization that would change the course of the war in Europe. The radius of action had been broken, not by a new fuel tank, but by the sheer will of pilots who refused to turn back. However, will alone cannot win a war of attrition. The Army Air Forces needed a machine that could do what Howell did, but do it all the way to Berlin and back without ditching in the ocean. They needed a plane that combined the range of a bomber with the agility of a fighter. And thousands of miles away, in a hangar in California, a team of engineers was frantically trying to mate a British engine to an American airframe to create exactly that. But while those engineers were refining the P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that would eventually claim the title of Cadillac of the Skies, the men of the 8th Air Force knew that their survival in 1943 didn't depend on a sleek thoroughbred of the future. It depended on the Jug. The story of Captain Howell is a narrative composite, a distilled representation of 1,000 desperate decisions made in the cockpits of the 56th Fighter Group. But the machine that made such heroism possible, the P-47 Thunderbolt, was very real. And its legacy is forged in a specific kind of industrial violence that no other fighter could withstand. To the bomber crews of the Bloody Hundredth, the P-47 wasn't just an airplane, it was an iron guarantee. When they looked out of their waist gun windows and saw that massive milk jug fuselage and the elliptical wings painted with white identification stripes, they saw the only thing in the sky capable of absorbing the punishment they faced daily. This bond, the Brotherhood of the Jug, was built on a technical reality that is often overlooked in favor of aerodynamics: survivability. The P-51 Mustang and the Spitfire were powered by liquid-cooled engines. Their V-12 seconds were wrapped in a delicate lattice of coolant lines and radiators. A single 7.92 mm bullet from a German infantryman's rifle could pierce a radiator, drain the coolant, and seize the engine in minutes. They were fragile swashbucklers. The P-47, however, was a flying tank. Its air-cooled R-2800 radial engine had no radiator to puncture, no coolant to leak. It was simply a massive block of aluminum and steel fins. History records P-47 seconds returning to base with cylinders blown completely off the crankcase, with connecting rods severed, and with pistons seized, yet the engine kept turning. It was a machine that refused to die. The ultimate testament to this durability occurred on the 26th of June, 1943, involving a real pilot named Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, the famous Zemke's Wolfpack. During an escort mission near Dieppe, Johnson's P-47 was crippled. His canopy was shattered, hydraulic fluid blinded him, and his aircraft was falling out of the sky. As he limped toward the channel, a German ace named Egon Mayer in a Focke-Wulf 190 spotted the wounded bird. Mayer pulled up behind Johnson and emptied his guns. He fired hundreds of rounds of machine gun fire and 20 mm cannon shells into the Thunderbolt. The P-47 absorbed it all. The rudder was shredded, The fuselage was a sieve, and the metal skin was curled back like peeled fruit. But the armor plate behind Johnson's seat held, and the R-2800 engine kept roaring. Mayer, having expended all his ammunition, flew alongside Johnson. He looked at the flying wreck, shook his head in disbelief, and rocked his wings in a salute before peeling away. He physically couldn't shoot the plane down. Johnson landed that aircraft in England. When the ground crew counted the holes, they stopped at 200. This was the unique selling point of the Thunderbolt. It didn't have the range of the Mustang or the turn radius of the Spitfire, but it possessed a kinetic dominance that changed the psychology of the air war. When a P-47 pilot dove, he was riding the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. He hit the enemy with the momentum of a freight train, and when he was hit back, he usually survived. The pilots of the 56 Fighter Group loved the Jug so intensely that when the order came to transition to the superior P-51 Mustang later in the war, they refused. They were the only group in the 8th Air Force to fly the P-47 from the beginning of the war to the very end. They didn't want the Cadillac, they wanted the tank. They understood that in the brutal math of 1943, when the Luftwaffe was at its peak and the radius of action was a death sentence for stragglers, you didn't need a plane that looked good in a parade. You needed a plane that could take a 20mm shell to the face and still bring you home to the mud of East Anglia. The little friends didn't just clear the skies, they altered the morale of the big friends. Knowing that a pilot like Howell or Johnson or Gabreski or Zemke was willing to push his fuel to the limit and throw his heavy fighter into the path of a 20mm cannon shell, gave the bomber crews the will to press on through the flak. It forged a bond between fighter and bomber that transcended rank and unit. It was a covenant written in high-octane fuel and burned metal. We go home together or not at all. But as 1944 approached, the war changed again. The P-47 had held the line, battered and bruised, fighting a defensive war of attrition against superior numbers. But the Allies were done playing defense. They needed to stop protecting bombers and start hunting the Luftwaffe in their own backyard all the way to Berlin. The P-47 had broken the Luftwaffe's nose, but to break its back, the Army Air Forces needed a new kind of weapon, a weapon that learned the hard lessons of the Thunderbolt's limited range and combined them with British aerodynamic genius. The era of the Jug was the era of the shield. The next era would belong to the sword. That sword, the North American P-51 Mustang, would eventually gleam in the sunlight over Berlin, escorting bombers all the way to the target and back without ever checking a fuel gauge in panic. But the road to that victory was paved with the aluminum bones of Thunderbolts lying at the bottom of the English Channel. The price of the sky in 1943 wasn't paid in dollars or industrial output, it was paid in the radius of action. It was a tax levied on men like Captain Howell, who understood that the only way to stretch a fuel tank beyond its physical limit was to subtract the return trip from the equation. Years after the war, the pilots who flew the Jug rarely spoke about drag coefficients or turbo supercharger ducting. They spoke about the fence, that invisible line in the sky where the safe world ended and the cold reality of the North Sea began. They remembered the vibration of the R-2800 engine not as a mechanical noise, but as the heartbeat of their survival. Captain Howell's decision to ditch wasn't madness. It was the ultimate expression of the escort pilot's creed. He traded a machine for men. In the cold ledger of the Army Air Forces, the loss of P-47 serial number 42 to 226 was a write-off of roughly $85,000. But in the human calculus of war, that write-off bought 10 veteran airmen the chance to fly 20 more missions. It bought grandfathers for children who hadn't been born yet. The heretical solution proved that while technology dictates the boundaries of the possible, it is the pilot who decides where the impossible begins. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never the prettiest plane on the tarmac. It was a bucket of bolts with the glide ratio of a stone and a scoop that could kill you if you touched the water. But for the bomber crews of the 8th Air Force, beauty wasn't found in the laminar flow wings of a Mustang. It was found in the ugly, bruised silhouette of a Jug that refused to leave their wing. The P-47 held the line when the line was breaking. It absorbed the blows that would have shattered a lesser machine, serving as the battered shield of the bomber offensive until the sword was ready to be drawn. But the P-47 had taken the war as far as its radial engine could go. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, but it wasn't dead. To finish the job, to strike the heart of the Reich and sweep the skies clean, the Allies needed a hunter that could go where the Jug could not. They needed a machine that was currently sitting in a hangar, rejected by the British RAF and deemed a failure by American engineers, a plane with a fatal flaw in its belly that nearly killed its test pilots before it ever saw combat. If you want to understand the engineering miracle that finally broke the Luftwaffe's back, you need to see the story of the P-51 Mustang and the secret modification that turned a failure into a legend. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss that briefing. Share this video with someone who understands that sometimes the heaviest armor is just the will to stay. We'll see you in the next one.